In 1822, Robert Cambell, a penniless Tyrone teenager, left this house for America. 2 years later, he was cheating death in the Rocky Mountains.
Two men around Robert Cambell get shot. Sublette gets shot and wounded in the arm right in front of him. A guy behind him named Sinclair gets killed.
Through scorching summers and Arctic winters.
In the wintertime, it's -40.
One of the first Ulster-Scots to pioneer the true Wild West.
They were the first white men exploring a totally uncharted, vast wilderness.
I like it to the astronauts of our era.
For 10 years, he shared his life with Native Americans.
They had no idea where they was going. Then they started talking to the Indian people in conversational sign language.
His was an epic love story.
Robert wrote to Virginia, "You will be my counselor and my guide in life."
But his life also had more than its share of tragedy.
The Campbells had 13 children. 10 of them died before the age of 8.
He would become a multi-millionaire, one of the wealthiest, most respected men in Missouri. But until now, this life has remained largely unknown.
He's the man who's always in the background, but he's always there.
All throughout the 10 years he's in the Rockies, he just does what needs to be done.
This is the story of Robert Cambell, Mountain Man. Life would take Robert Cambell a long way from the Glenelly Valley and Auchalane House, where he was born in 1804. His father had built the house 20 years earlier, proudly marked with the Duke of Argyll's crest, honouring the family's Scottish roots. At 18, Robert Cambell followed his older brother Hugh to America.
If we think about Hugh and Robert growing up as boys, they were growing up in an environment which in some respects was really quite rosy. And you had that sense of prosperity. What happens is, after the Battle of Waterloo, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Irish economy nosedives, which saw a surge in the number of people leaving Ulster at the time. They, of course, are also younger sons. Andrew's the eldest. They're not going to inherit the land, the estate, so they've got to look outside Ulster for a future.
Alan McFarland was also raised in the Glenelly Valley. He's Robert Cambell's great-great-great-great-nephew.
I'm a descendant of Robert Cambell. All the surviving family members are descended from his eldest brother Andrew, who took over the family farm outside Plumbridge. And Robert, being the youngest in the family, probably thought his prospects weren't great, so like many Ulster-Scots, he went to seek his fortune in America.
Like his ancestor, Alan has an adventurous streak. He too has led men in conflict. And, like Campbell, he's been involved in the world of politics. Now he's travelling to America to retrace his ancestors' steps and shed light on his remarkable untold story. Campbell would become one of the first handful of men into the vast uncharted Rocky Mountains. The select band of frontier fur trappers who'd become known as the Mountain Men. Starting as a clerk, he would gain rapid promotion to leader of his own trapping brigade. After 10 years in the mountains, he'd spend the next 40 building a business empire in commerce, property, banking, even riverboats. In fact, he gave Mark Twain his first job as a Mississippi River pilot. He was a key figure in major historical events, but always in the background. We're left with just a few images to show what he was like.
I think, and it is a Scotch-Irish trait, I was brought up not to be bold. It's a word that your parents used, certainly in my time. Don't you be bold, you behave yourself. And I think it's a Scotch-Irish, or maybe it's an Irish thing, about not being extrovert. Robert was almost certainly brought up like that, working hard in the background, going and saying, well, here's a chance here, and making money. And of course he died a multi-millionaire, and I just feel he's been lost to history, and I'm keen to just put him back where he belongs.
Alan's journey begins in St. Louis, Missouri. It would soon become a key city for waves of settlers travelling west. But when Campbell arrived in 1823 for a job as a store clerk, it was little more than an outpost. For Campbell and his contemporaries, this was where civilization ended.
The time Robert arrived here, St. Louis would being a small village on the frontier, he would have seen Native Americans, a place of hustle and bustle and a lot of people moving through. They call it the gateway to the West because from our earliest days, people are always using this as a stop in moving further west.
Robert Cambell would eventually become a leading citizen of St. Louis. The famous Gateway Arch marks the spot where he set up his first business premises. But the most tangible reminder of his life here is the home he shared with his wife and children, now the Campbell House Museum.
Robert's fur trade experience, Robert's early mercantile experience, Mrs. Campbell's devotion to her children, her surviving sons very much romanticized that family history.
Alan's fascinated by the vast archive of Robert Cambell's personal papers and effects. This was where his ancestors' eventful life ended. But it's where Alan's journey into the past begins.
His personal possessions, his homestead, his personal papers were all conserved. And so in telling Robert's story, we're able to tell the Irish immigration, American expansion story.
One of the things that's very interesting is their mother, Elizabeth Buchanan. The Buchanans were a very important family, very much connected into emigration. They were involved in the emigrant trade, lots of connections through the port of Derry to the New World. So they were aware, I think, of that wider sort of sense of commercial opportunities.
In 1803, America, then consisting of just 17 eastern states, paid $15 million to Emperor Napoleon of France for a huge swathe of land in the center of the country. This was unexplored wilderness and home to many native tribes. The deal was known as the Louisiana Purchase. The French had started the fur trade in present-day Canada. Mink, fox and otter had long been popular for garments. But demand for top hats made from beaver would surpass everything else, making this new territory a huge draw to the burgeoning American fur trade, the fastest-growing business in the country.
The Americans decided to just recruit trappers, bring them up the Missouri River. The trappers would spend the winter living in the mountains. So that's kind of the situation that we found when Robert Cambell came out as a mountain man.
Enterprising young men, 100 men to ascend the River Missouri to its source.
When he first traveled into the wilderness in 1825, Campbell was following other young men, attracted by this ad, placed in the St. Louis newspaper. History would call them Ashley's 100.
The key person was General William Ashley, who'd been a military officer in the War of 1812. So you had a very clear military command structure, and these were military operations. You have your scouts out in front, you have people out making meat and killing buffalo, you have your flank guards, and you have your rear guard. But when you got right up in the mountains and the streams, often it was two people. And usually what happened is that one of them kept guard because of the threat, whilst the other put the traps in.
What was a gently reared Ulster farm boy to make of this? Nothing could have prepared Campbell for the life-changing journey he was about to take.
How did someone who grew up in a farm in Ireland that wasn't particularly rugged or certainly not a wilderness, did he find himself living this kind of amazingly rugged life out in the Rocky Mountains, especially given his health? In his early days here in St. Louis, he began to suffer from a breathing ailment and terrible coughing and coughing up blood. And he saw a doctor here in St. Louis that said, "Go west."
Young man, your symptoms are consumptive, and I advise you to go to the Rocky Mountains. I have before sent 2 or 3 young men there in your condition, and they came back restored to health and hardy as bucks.
It's one thing to be advised to go west and breathe the mountain air, and it's another thing to join the fur trade and arguably add to some romance, because certainly in St. Louis, there would have been many, many stories about the fur trade, the river trade, the Native Americans.
In a wilderness far from civilization, the threats all around Campbell were very real indeed.
You don't have a house. You probably have a tent. You can't really build a fire in the tent. So you got the fire outside. You're still contending with the potential for hostile Indians coming around. And you have animals that can eat you, you know?
Bears were the fiercest of predators. Bear attacks, the stuff of legend. One survivor of such an attack was about to become Campbell's mentor and friend, Jedediah Smith.
The description is that the bear put his jaws around Jed Smith's head and bit down and clawed at him, broke ribs, almost lost an ear. By the time they had killed the bear and laid Smith down, one of Smith's men said, "Your ear is hanging by a thread. We're not going to be able to save it." And Smith is quoted as saying, "You must save my ear and sew it on somehow." So they went and got a needle and a thread, and someone actually sewed his ear back onto his head.
Doc Ivory understands more than most what Campbell went through in the early 1800s. He is a 21st century mountain man who spent half his life journeying into the wilderness. Travelling on horseback and on foot, often on his own, living off the land. Doc belongs to a select, invitation-only group, the American Mountain Men.
A lot of people see people dressed like me or similar and assume that they're hardcore when in reality they're kind of reenactors. Live it for a couple of days and go down and have a shower. For me, it's a lifestyle, and so for me, I'm not satisfied with just playing it. I'm living it.
Doc will guide Alan through the survival skills learned by Campbell and the other mountaineers, as they first called themselves.
When we refer to them as mountain men, they were mountaineers because they traveled the valleys and they traveled up in the hills looking for beaver, but generally they could make better time along the river courses than they could trying to go over the top of the mountains like that, unless it was an Indian trail that they knew about.
Doc can catch and skin a beaver or deer. He can make his own lead shot over an open fire. He can survive at 40 below. And he's taking Alan into the wilderness where his ancestor worked and wandered.
I may not know every fact about the fur trade, but I can tell you what it feels like to tip over a dugout canoe in March. I can tell you what it feels like to cross the desert in the same conditions at the same time period in the same number of miles, dealing with sleet, dealing with wind, dealing with snow, dealing with rain, and dealing with river crossings. And that's a great satisfaction to me.
When Robert Cambell set off on that first expedition as clerk to Jedediah Smith, he would live in the wilderness without a break for the next 4 years. The fur trade was centered on present-day Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Utah. Back then, the first maps called it unorganized territory.
There were 60 men to the brigade. Ashley had hired 60 men, and they were heading out on their way to meet up with the trappers that had stayed in the mountains that winter. Smith had been in the mountains for a couple of years, so he had some experience, and he was teaching it to Campbell.
Campbell would quickly learn every aspect of the trapper's life, and he needed to be a fast learner.
Well, first of all, they were 1,800 miles from any civilization in either direction. So, you know, they were pretty much relying on one another and what they had with them. As Campbell said in his diary, we left St. Louis too late. They left in November, and they hit a tremendous bad winter and snowstorm. And the winter was so bad, half their mules were dying. And they were running out of food. They had to eat their mules, and it was a tough survival situation for everyone.
The snow was up to the chests of the horses. They had rudimentary idea of where they were going, but they basically had to follow the river or an Indian trail. There were no good maps at all.
One of my favorite stories, Joe Meek is so hungry, he puts his hand into an anthill and lets the ants crawl up on his hand, and then he licks them off. That's how hungry he was. They're thirsty, they take turns. Today they cut Joe Meek's mule's neck and drain the blood out. Tomorrow they'll cut somebody else's horse and drain the, not enough to kill the animal, make them a little weak, but enough that they get some sustenance from that animal's blood. It was a tough way to live.
The sort of mythology of the independent mountain man trapper coming into the wilderness, they weren't all that rugged, and many of them perished from various things, not only being killed by Indians, but also the cold winter weather and starvation and so forth.
A lot of mountain men drowned crossing rivers. There was a lot of fatalities there. I would think if somebody did a study, and it approached like 15 to 20% of the deaths they had recorded were crossing rivers, just drowning. Because in the springtime, the snow melts, all the rivers are roaring.
Like the first Ulster-Scots settlers in the east a century earlier, Campbell and the other trappers would come to rely on native people, learning skills to help them survive the extremes of this harsh environment.
They had no idea where they was going. So then they started talking to the Indian people in conversational sign language. That was the only way that they could communicate, but also that is the only way that our Indian people could communicate. I see you, you see me, you come, I'll come there, we'll meet, we'll sit down and we'll talk. Maybe we'll shake hands, we may be friends, or we may leave as enemies.
Having contact, intimate contact, with a tribe or a village under a leader was very, very important.
Mountain men adopted native clothing like buckskin and buffalo hide.
Winter in the Rockies is what the trapper was always thinking about. So let's kind of get you dressed for winter. You're not quite ready. So let's start here with the coat. And this is an old buffalo robe that I used as a mani over my pack horse. May not fit quite as well over your buckskin jacket, but there you go.
Goodness.
That feels pretty good, doesn't it?
Yep.
Now the questions ask, why do you have the fur on the outside? Well, the animal has the fur on the outside, and as it rains, he sheds it. But let's put you on a proper hat for the winter. Let's put you on a little bit of wolf. And wolf fur is a very nice fur for the winter. Oh yeah, now you're starting to take on a little bit of that Campbell look I like. But your hands are exposed. And probably the best fur for protection on your hands is a beaver. So go ahead and put your hand in there.
They're lovely and warm, aren't they?
How about that?
Yeah.
Huh? How about that? You know, I didn't realize you were such a hairy man. Remember, if you went back to St. Louis from the mountains, here comes Robert Cambell. And they'd go, oh my gosh, what happened to Robert Cambell? He was such a nice man. And now you come back and you look like you've changed. But you just adapted.
Amazing.
Frozen and starving, Campbell's expedition was saved from complete disaster by taking refuge in a Pawnee village.
The Pawnees were away from their camp. Some of the people that were with Smith and Campbell knew where there was corn caches, and they got into those to feed themselves.
The relations the Pawnee had with the traders that are coming through was really pretty good. A lot of fur-bearing animals out here. Pawnee were more than happy to trap them and skin them and give them to the traders, and in return, they get all these trade goods. So you're getting pots, pans, guns, knives, things that make their life a whole lot easier.
The Indians come back, the Pawnees come back, realize that the Americans, along with Campbell, are going to reimburse them for using their corn. And I think the chief found that to be an endearing characteristic and some sort of frontier justice, if you will, and invites them to stay in his camp. I think it shows Smith's leadership, and he's already anointed, if you will, Campbell as his second in command. And that from that point on, Campbell starts to learn at Smith's side how you can make friends with people that you've just met and how you can help them, they help you.
Most of the traders were actually decent guys that dealt pretty fairly with the Indians. And word gets around fast if you're a cheat. And any man knows when he's being cheated, any human. You know when you're being cheated, and you won't do repeat business with someone that you know cheated you twice at least. And so Indians were the same way. They knew when they were being treated poorly.
Campbell's Ulster-Scots family were devout Presbyterians with a strict moral code. His own sense of honesty and integrity would serve him well in his dealings with Indians. In fact, he became blood brother to a Flathead chief.
Robert Cambell, I think, was a man of high integrity. If he told you he was going to do it, he was going to follow through. If he told you he couldn't do it, you knew that he thought it through and didn't see it as a plausible way to go. Every time you hear about Campbell, he's trustworthy, he's dependable, and he's a guy that would have your back.
The daily challenges Campbell faced must have seemed a million miles from his upbringing in rural Ulster. And the trade he was learning was not for the faint-hearted.
So here we have exactly the habitat of what they were looking for. They were looking for beaver that were building dams using the willows as their habitat for eating and also damming up the creek. So you would see a series of these going down this creek here, and there's good sign you can see a fresh cut beaver stick there. But the question is, how does a trapper get that furry beaver caught and then processed? Well, this is what they used to catch them with. An original beaver trap from about 1830s, which was the time of Robert Cambell. So you were holding a trap, literally, that he would have been well acquainted with. This is the pan, this is the dog. When the dog is flipped over in this groove, the pan is set, the jaws are open, the beaver come and step into the pan, this jaws slam shut, and then you wade in. At times I've waded up to here to get that furry beast so that we can make some kind of credit money at Rendezvous.
After winter in the wilderness, Campbell and the others were ready for their annual highlight, Rendezvous. This was the time of year when trappers, traders, and Indians got together to sell their furs, get fresh supplies for the year ahead, and let their hair down.
When they got to Rendezvous, these men had been in the mountains without any company, and they got together and they basically went absolutely daft.
When you got to Rendezvous and there were things you hadn't tasted in a year, all caution to the wind, whiskey on the house, we've got meat, we've got dried fruit, we've got chocolate, we've got coffee, and we've got whiskey.
A Presbyterian raised in Ulster could never have imagined scenes like this.
The kegs would be broken out and the men would be paying for it. And there are the most amazing scenes of people shooting each other whilst in drunken brawls. They would do horse racing.
There is one account that even the straight-laced Campbell overindulged.
It describes Campbell on his knees on the grass, as he puts it, giving forth. Clearly Robert had had a sherbet or two too many and wasn't able to keep it in.
Trappers worked and travelled with natives, established relationships with them, fought and died alongside them. Campbell would have lifelong friendships with several Indians, including the Crow chief Longhair.
Well, Longhair was noted for being a very wise leader. From the white man's world, the fascination with his hair was that his hair was very, very long, 11 feet or more. His hair was measured by Campbell.
In this volatile land, violence was a fact of life. Alliances constantly changed, and tribes fought among themselves as well as against the fur men. Indians wanted guns, so they became one of the most highly prized trade items. For the mountain men, they were essential for survival.
I've fired tanks and rifles and all sorts of things during my military career. What sort of weapons would the mountain men have used?
Well, the weapons varied, from a knife and a tomahawk to a belt pistol, but the main weapon was the rifle. Now, these are called muzzle loaders. Muzzle loaders are different than breech loaders. As a muzzle loader, you took your powder horn, you poured the powder into a powder measure, you poured the measure of powder in here, then we take a patch and cut it off, put the patch there, the round ball that fits here, and then we take a ramrod to seat the ball. We want this frizzen down so that when we set the trigger and touch it off, a spark will ignite the powder there, and then that will ignite the main charge, and boom, the rifle goes off. If the wind's blowing, if the rain is coming down, it doesn't work. If your flint is dull, it doesn't work. Then, could you wait a minute? My gun would go off. Just give me a minute. They didn't necessarily wait.
When it did come to a fight, an Indian brave could loose 6 deadly arrows inside a minute.
You're ready to go.
Okay.
Campbell and the other mountain men needed their rifles to work first time.
Great shot! Ow!
Horses were another prized item. Marauding Indians would often steal them from the mountain men. They, in turn, would raid native villages to get them back, with maybe a few extra. But the braves of the Blackfoot were feared more than any other tribe. They wanted more than horses. They wanted blood.
Blackfeet, the only time they came to rendezvous, they had a big fight. One of our sub-Indian agents met a Blackfoot chief, and the Blackfoot chief told him, you know, we've traded with the Canadians at their forts up north of us, and you send us traders, and we'll keep them alive, we'll make sure they're protected. But you're trappers. We don't like trappers coming into our country, and we'll continue to fight them and kill them. They didn't like the idea of people coming and taking something out of their area. They wanted to be able, they're just like anybody else. If somebody's going to make a nickel on that, I want it to be me because it's in my area.
Scalping was a common occurrence in this dangerous and volatile world, by both natives and mountain men. It had a profound effect on Campbell.
They were the first Indians that I saw scalped. The Iroquois put their feet on the dead body, fastened their fingers in the hair, and running the knife around the skull, yanked the scalp off in an instant. It was a horrid sight.
The scalp, taking usually just a small portion, not taking all the hair, but cutting and taking a small portion of the hair was proof that one had vanquished an enemy. And not only that, then one might wear scalps, let's say on a belt or part of a shirt, to show I did this, and then someone else in the war party would say yes, and there's his scalp to prove it.
Campbell had his own encounters with the dreaded Blackfoot.
Round Valley at the foot of Bear Lake in Utah was the site for two rendezvous in 1827 and 1828. Robert Cambell was at both of them. In the 1828 one, he'd had a real fright. He was on his way back to rendezvous from the north. He got about halfway down Bear Lake and they'd camped overnight, and early in the morning they were attacked by the Blackfeet. They fought about a 6-hour battle when they started to run out of powder and ammunition, and Campbell and somebody describes as a little Spaniard, it was agreed they would jump on their horses and try to break through the Blackfeet lines to go down to rendezvous to provide a rescue party, and that's what happened.
We dashed right through into the face of the enemy, as it is not their mode to stand a charge. They separated. We went at a gallop, I and the little Spaniard. We were going at such speed that my horse fell with me. The whole of one side of my face was skinned.
But he was quick to recover and galloped on for reinforcements. When they returned, the Blackfoot had fled. Campbell lived 4 full years in the mountains. Over the following 6, he would spend time in St. Louis, but was always drawn back to the wilderness. The daily dangers he lived with continued to alarm his family. His brother Hugh back in the safety of Philadelphia, and his sister Anne at home in Ireland.
In the name of wonder, Robert dear, what keeps you on the Rocky Mountains so long, exposed to wild beasts, and worse than all, to the fierce rage of the hostile and merciless Indians? It is not justifiable in us to risk that life God gave us for the sake of riches. Should you return home, on earth there could not be a greater pleasure to us.
Campbell's first mentor, Jedediah Smith, had been killed by Indians in 1831. Campbell decided it was time to strike out on his own. He'd spent 7 years employed by others, learning how the fur trade worked. Now he was prepared to shoulder the risk himself, bringing supplies to rendezvous.
I paid a visit to my relatives in Ireland in the spring of 1832. Returning that spring to St. Louis, I again started for the Indian country, taking with me a small outfit of goods, blankets, clothes, and only 5 men and 15 horses. 10 of the horses were loaded with merchandise.
Well, as a researcher, I'm forever grateful to him for his 1832 expedition. And he kept detailed records of where he got all these supplies, and he kept detailed records at the rendezvous as to who he sold them to and how much. And so we have a great record of what it costs to outfit a contingent like that in St. Louis and what the profit potential was for rendezvous. And one thing that I remember was the fact that he bought 100 pounds of flour for $1, and he was selling at rendezvous for $1 a tin cupful. So that's pretty good business.
Like many Ulster-Scots before and after him, Campbell saw an opportunity and grasped it. His expedition would travel alongside that of his friend, William Sublette. They would soon become successful business partners.
Robert Cambell was one of the few guys who really made some money in this business. He came out in '32 with his first small outfit to make enough money to become a partner with William Sublette. And then Campbell and Sublette put together a fur trade business that just made a whole ton of money.
You'll find that the Scots-Irish were kind of the meat and the bones and the muscle of the fur trade. There was a hardiness about them, and with the education and the drive to succeed in business, rose to prominent levels. McTavish, McGilvery, Campbell's obviously were men who were very well respected in the North American fur trade.
They understand money,
And that gave you a huge advantage in the New World. You had an expertise there that was in relatively short supply. You had a lot of labor, manual labor, people willing to pitch in and do the dirty work. And so if you had a strong background, a business background, as people did in Ulster, like the Campbells, you were at a huge advantage in the New World.
I don't think he lost money in the fur trade. And because he was there, he was exceedingly important to the customer of the fur trade, the Indians. If there's a monopoly in the fur trade, the Indians get cheated. But once there's two, then they compete with each other and they keep the prices down and they treat you better. And I think that's the role, to me, that Campbell deserves the greatest credit for. He was a businessman. He knew how to make a profit. But in his dealings that I have come across with Indians, I think he was an absolutely honorable guy.
Sublette clearly saw Campbell as an honourable man, but he would soon have reason to thank Campbell for his life when they were attacked by a war party of the Grovon tribe.
They thought at first they were seeing buffalo coming down the hillside. They got their telescopes out, and lo and behold, it turns out to be Indians.
Out for revenge after one of their leaders was shot and killed by a trapper, mistaking him for a Blackfoot.
Well, pretty much as soon as they realized it was Indians, they sent a runner back up to the camp to get reinforcements. And so Campbell and Sublette, they all head down to the south. About 250 trappers show up down there as reinforcements.
And there was some story that Campbell and Sublette made living wills as they were
Yes,
galloping.
as they're galloping off, they're telling each other, you know, I'll take care of your family and you take care of my family and I'll make sure your will gets through the estate. And they're exchanging their last will and testaments as they're riding off into battle. The Grovants, they kind of slink back into the trees and they're just blasting away all afternoon.
The bloody fight would become known as the Battle of Pierre's Hole. It claimed over 40 lives, and Campbell was at the centre of it.
He's kind of one of those guys that was a leader, but he was kind of a leader in the shadows, you know? It's like every time you read something, Campbell's involved. He may not be the primary man, but he's involved. I mean, you take the Battle of Pierre's Hole in 1832. Two men around Robert Cambell get shot. Sublette gets shot and wounded in the arm right in front of him. A guy behind him named Sinclair gets killed. And Robert Cambell just keeps doing what he seems to keep doing all throughout the 10 years he's in the Rockies. He just does what needs to be done.
Campbell, in his accounts, seems to suggest that he actually, after Sublette was wounded, he actually dragged him out of the battle and got him off to safety.
Yep, that's exactly right. So from that standpoint, I imagine Sublette thought Campbell was quite the hero.
In 1835, on a break from the mountains and recuperating from his recurring chest problems at his brother's house in Philadelphia, Robert met Virginia Kyle, second cousin of his sister-in-law. Virginia was 14. Campbell was 31. Within a year, he'd fallen for her.
I always describe Virginia as being very precocious. She was being courted by other men besides Robert Cambell. She was a very, very pretty young girl, very attractive.
Your locket, even in my sickness as in health, has been suspended around my neck.
Write very soon a long and interesting letter. Your most affectionate, though tantalizing, Virginia.
Campbell's courtship persisted in the face of total opposition from his family, his friend and partner Sublette, and Virginia's mother.
It will be useless for you to urge this matter, as I can never consent for Virginia to marry under the age of 18.
Separated by 17 years and 1,000 miles, the relationship was not without its difficulties.
He's courting Virginia, and Virginia breaks off their engagement. You know, Robert writes the most maudlin, pathetic, heartbroken letter that has ever been written in the history of pathetic love letters.
You cannot imagine my feelings while I thus write you. The last lingering ray of happiness has now vanished, and you've doomed me to a life of wretchedness.
Against the odds, the relationship survived. When Virginia reached 19, her mother finally approved the union, and they married in 1841.
Robert wrote to Virginia a few weeks before their marriage, and at the end of the letter he says something to the effect that, of course, you will be my counselor and my guide in life, and looking forward to this partnership that they're going to have together. But he ends that comment with, of course, no one else will know that.
Virginia had a strong, independent streak. She broke social custom and travelled without a chaperone. She delighted in entertaining and would become an accomplished household manager. The couple became true loving partners throughout their lives. But at this stage, they had no idea of the tragic years ahead. Two years before meeting Virginia, Campbell had become an unlikely travel agent when a Scottish adventurer paid $500 to join a trapping expedition. Sir William Drummond Stewart of Merthley in Perthshire, a cavalry officer at the Battle of Waterloo, was seeking the excitement of the West and the opportunity to come face to face with native tribes. He's been described as Wyoming's first tourist. He and Campbell would become firm friends. The wealthy and somewhat eccentric Drummond Stewart brought his own artist on his travels, Alfred Jacob Miller.
They encapsulate this incredible spiritual quality of light that radiates through these pieces, that makes them come alive. And I know to his audiences in the 1850s and 60s, that's what they were looking for. And I think helped to shape the American public's perception of what the West was, that made it easy for people to think, hey, we're going on the Oregon Trail. It's not going to be so bad. Oh, yeah, it's not.
Miller's paintings have come to assume huge significance as the only contemporary visual record of how Campbell and the other trappers lived in the wilderness.
And the detail in this one down here looks particularly contrasting in terms of the red of his blanket and the arrow about to go in.
It does. Everyone was looking east at this point, to the art centers of Paris and Munich and elsewhere in Europe. And artists like Miller are the first to turn their eyes westward. It does show everyday life in the West at this moment. I think as long as we are able to acknowledge that there is a sense of fancy and spirituality and romanticism in his depictions of this time and place, we should and can still deem them very historically important.
Drummond Stewart travelled with Campbell on the long trek to Green River in present-day Wyoming for the 1833 rendezvous.
The Green River rendezvous site is probably my most favourite place in America. And it's special for me because in 1833, Robert Cambell came out from St. Louis with the resupply caravan. William Drummond Stewart said it was probably the most exciting and the last of the really great rendezvous sites here. Thousands and thousands of Indians from the various tribes. They had 3 fur companies here. You can imagine the scene on this enormous plain. You had horse racing, shooting competitions, Indians firing arrows, general sort of drunkenness and chaos and mayhem. It must have been the most wonderful sight.
The rendezvous is commemorated each July in the town of Pinedale. Visitors come from far and wide for the parade and pageant, to hear historians and enjoy events around the Museum of the Mountain Man.
These are people coming out a long ways from anywhere. I like it to the astronauts of our era. The mountain men kind of opened the West, and this museum mainly focuses on the rendezvous era from about 1825 to 1840. That's kind of the glamorous era of the Rocky Mountain fur trade and what Robert Cambell was a part of.
The romance surrounding the fur trade and the mountain men draws people from all age groups and backgrounds who want to learn more and who see themselves as part of its legacy.
You look in the mountains back there, it's just like that's what the mountains looked like when the Indians and people were first coming here saw.
Trips has good reason to be mad. Last winter, he and Fitz...
I always loved the Native American culture. I always read books about it when I was young. I'm fascinated. I wish I was an Indian, honestly.
Anyway.
Well, I stopped doing this for a 15-year period because it was too lonely to be a mountain man. We don't have any mountains in Denmark.
When he met Virginia in 1835, Campbell was ready for a change. The Pierre's Hole battle in 1832 had given him a real fright. A year later, he'd almost drowned when his boat capsized in the Yellowstone River. Now aged 31, he was becoming tired of what he'd once seen as a bold and dashing life. He was also canny enough to sense the imminent decline of the fur trade and began to look for less hazardous business opportunities.
The fur trade was starting to collapse by 1835, and so Robert, by that same time frame, was anxious to get out. He was writing letters home that were along the lines of, you know, if I get one good offer, then I'm going to fold this whole business. So he was looking for new opportunities and was in the right place at the right time.
He'd made many river trips transporting hides. His final one would be memorable.
The Platte River was famed in journals out throughout the fur trade here as a mile wide and an inch deep, and people thought it wasn't navigable. Platte's interesting because Robert Cambell brought the furs down the River Platte by bullboat, and a bullboat is like a coracle. It's basically animal skins on a wooden frame. Campbell built these and brought the furs down some 500 miles all the way back down the Platte River, and you can see how difficult that might be, but he managed it, and there's a newspaper report in the St. Louis newspaper that he was the first man ever to navigate the Platte River in a bullboat.
Mr. Campbell was not molested in any manner by the numerous bands of Indians through whose country he was compelled to pass.
In 1836, Campbell looked east from St. Louis rather than west, traveling to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, buying a year's supply of trade goods at a time. His fortunes would seesaw, but within a few years eclipse his older brother's modest success. In 1839, he was elected to the board of the Missouri State Bank. He was appointed a colonel of the Missouri militia and raised troops for the war with Mexico in 1846. With his brother Hugh, he secured funds to help famine victims back home in Ireland. He was elected president of the bank. His growing empire would cover hotels, riverboats, and property in several states.
The most often quoted story about Robert's character in business is at a fort out in the Kansas Territory. A large debt was to be paid to an individual, and that individual refused notes signed by the United States Treasury Secretary, but gladly accepted notes signed by Robert Cambell, who, as the president of the State Bank of Missouri, had signed all of the banknotes.
But all their wealth and position couldn't isolate Robert and Virginia Campbell from tragedy through the illnesses endemic to the growing city.
Well, the Campbells had 13 children. 10 of them died before the age of 8. Most of them died of epidemic illnesses, very common to St. Louis. 3 of the children died of measles. 2 of them died of cholera-related illnesses. 1 of scarlet fever, 1 of diphtheria.
In the summer of 1847, young Virginia Campbell, age 25, buried 2 children and gave birth to a third in a span of about 10 weeks. She buried a 2-year-old son. A few weeks later, buried a 1-year-old daughter, and a few weeks after that, gave birth to another son. So Virginia would have almost constantly been wearing black through her 20s and 30s.
I've been to Bellefontaine on a number of occasions now, and it's very impressive, and you walk up to it and you see Robert and Virginia. It's only really when you move round the side that you appreciate the sheer horror that they went through, because they're listed are the 10 of their 13 children that died under the age of 8. We've now got 2 little grandsons, and the prospect of either of them being lost at a very young age is just horrific.
In 1854, Campbell moved his wife and remaining family to the exclusive New St. Louis neighbourhood of Lucas Place, and this luxurious house, a long way from the hardship of the Rockies. One of the first in St. Louis to have running water, gas lighting, and flush toilets. Here, with their staff of 10 servants, they would entertain generals and presidents. By this time, Campbell's days in the mountains may have been behind him, but such was the regard for his wilderness experience and his knowledge of and relationship with the native people that he was called to sit on the Indian Commission.
He came back for that peace treaty confab, I think it was 1851. And the fact that they, at that later stage, thought enough to want to have him there meant that there were several of those natives thought pretty much of Robert Cambell. And that the big thing, it was respect. It was, if you were true to your word, you got respect.
Sadly, the government didn't show the Native Americans much respect. They continually broke the treaties. Indian lands were confiscated for settlers, tribes forced into reservations.
People throughout the modern world don't realize that before 1492, there were approximately 6 million Indian people on the North American continent. By the 1890s, it had dwindled to less than 250,000.
Campbell had risen from mountain man to multi-millionaire, one of the wealthiest men in Missouri, if not America. In 1867, he fulfilled Virginia's dream, embarking on a grand tour of Europe with their 3 remaining sons, Hugh, Hazlitt, and James.
The trip started and ended in Ireland with a visit to the old home place where Robert could introduce his wife and sons to his siblings, to his nieces and nephews, but probably just as important, to show his boys the countryside that he ran about as a young man.
At a time when emigrating to America usually meant lifelong separation from home, he was one of the few Ulster-Scots who could afford to come back to his roots and the heritage that shaped him.
But he was always thinking of business, and one of my favorite letters that he wrote back from Europe was where he visited a manufacturer of the tiny glass seed beads in Venice. These tiny glass beads being made in Venice and eventually finding their way to the Rocky Mountains to be sewn by hand by Native American women into handicrafts.
In October 1879, Robert Cambell died. He was 75. His beloved Virginia would follow him just a few years later.
Hugh Campbell, Robert's oldest surviving son, had made the comment that he felt that Mrs. Campbell died of a broken heart 3 years after Robert had passed away. And I don't think that was just romantic fluff on the part of Hugh. I think he strongly believed that, given that Virginia died at such a young age, there might be some basis to truth for that.
In due course, his bachelor sons enjoyed several years traveling Europe, having inherited a fortune of more than $8 million.
His will was a gold mine earning 4,000 ounces of gold a year, 5,000 acres of land around St. Louis, and shares in 2 American railway companies.
In 1890, James died of flu in France, aged 30. Hugh, the brother who had taken charge of the family fortune, lived until 1930. Hazlitt, who'd always been of a delicate disposition, became a recluse who reputedly didn't leave the Lucas Place home in his last 30 years. When he died, Robert Cambell's line died with him. But the Campbell story would have a further chapter.
Hazlitt dies in 1938, and so begins the long adventure of dispersing his millions. But the short of it is Hazlitt had no will, and the law in the state of Missouri decreed that since Hazlitt had no children, he had no living siblings, and he had no living parents, that his heirs were his cousins.
The search for the Campbell cousins became an international sensation, with over 1,000 people claiming family connections. Alan McFarlane's family was amongst them.
The St. Louis Circuit Court was actually convened in London, in Dublin, in Omaha, and I believe in Belfast. And the British newspapers cover it quite intriguingly as the first time an American court was ever convened in the UK.
Here in Ulster, a lot of people got a fearful amount of money. The money came back to them basically after the Second World War, when many men were coming back to Northern Ireland to take up employment, getting somewhere in the region of £2.10 a week, to discover that they were sharing some of Robert Cambell's money. And one share of that was £10,300. And it helped to buy farms. It helped to send children to university. The best example we have, one lady related to the Campbell family, she and her husband were going to get about £1,000. They didn't get it all at once, they got it in 3 tranches. And for each tranche of about £350, they bought a small farm in Donegal. And the last tranche of money they got was in 1947. 2-3 years ago, the family sold it back to the Donegal Council for €2 million. That's the luck of the Campbell fortune.
In the end, 161 people were found to be legitimate heirs. Alan McFarlane's grandfather received £6,000 from the fortune. Alan's journey into the world of Robert Cambell has revealed an ancestor with a legacy on both sides of the Atlantic. A great-great-great-great-uncle of whom he's justifiably proud.
I've discovered a man who was genuinely an Ulster-Scot of honesty and integrity, who was trusted and respected by both settlers and Native Americans. And I'm keen that he's brought out of the shadows of American history and recognized for what he was, a genuine Rocky Mountain pioneer and one of the small band of men who opened up the American West.
We have a film for you later on tonight. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner takes us back to 1967 when a young white woman announces her engagement to a black doctor. What exactly will her parents say? Sidney Poitier stars at midnight.